Occasionally I see a trailer for a film where I think, yes, this is right up my alley. Themes reminiscent of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, ethical questions, Emma Stone dancing like a possessed marionette, ruffles. Poor Things had it all. Or so I thought. The film, which will be officially released on the 12th of January, is already receiving a lot of praise. At the time of me filming this video, it is rated 8.5 out of 10 on IMDb, 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it is getting a lot of hype. A review from December on rogerebert.com even describes it as the best movie of the year. And I am here to say that I respect that critic's opinion, but it's also wrong, and here's why. But first, some quick introductions. My name's Rosalind, and I'm a person on the internet with an opinion, which I plan to inflict on you today. I'm also a freelance journalist, and I've written about cinema for outlets including The Guardian and Reader's Digest, and that gives me the potentially misplaced belief that I can also make video essays. We'll see. As for Poor Things, it's a film set in a fantastical reimagining of Victorian England that follows the coming of age of Bella Baxter, a young woman who has been resurrected by an eccentric scientist. He wants to keep her forever indoors where her world is contained and safe. But as her mind develops, she rebels and decides to run away and see the world with a ridiculous lawyer who honestly doesn't seem to do much legal work during this film. He's basically a full-time womanizer. The film revolves around Bella's self-discovery and personal growth. She is, spoiler alert, quite literally a child's brain in an adult's body, owing to some interesting experimental choices that the eccentric scientist made when bringing her back to life. She begins the film in an adult body, but with childlike, almost animalistic behaviours. However, as the film progresses, she becomes increasingly interested in philosophy and socialism, her language skills and her literacy develop, and as time goes on, she becomes ultimately a woman who can pass within her society as a highly functioning woman, rather than the sort of monster of Frankenstein-esque identity that she incarnates at the beginning. This film annoyed me. I really wanted to like it because it's creative and thematically interesting, and I also really liked the director's earlier film from 2018, The Favourite, so I had high hopes. And in some ways, the film was great. Emma Stone's acting is superb, one could even call it a unique performance. She suddenly embodies the role, it's very impressive. And the supporting cast is also very good. Mark Ruffalo, for example, really leans into the role as the lawyer/rake/Casanova, with his fragile ego that doesn't deal well with not getting its own way. There are lots of entertaining performances in this film. The film's design is also noteworthy. It's very heightened and surreal and feels a little bit like a fever dream. So it's very fabricated, but at the same time, given the themes of the film, maybe that sense of artificiality and uncanniness is actually quite thematically fitting. I also loved the costumes. It's a bit of a fashion show at times, and also the music, or lack thereof, was great in my opinion because it really captured the protagonist's sense of dislocation and absence. Yet when my friend and I walked out of the cinema at the end of the film, we were both kind of underwhelmed. She's doing a PhD in reproductive ethics, we've both written a lot about feminism, and we just kind of turned to one another and went, what was that? What was the director, a male director, even trying to do here? Yep, it's time to talk about sex. There is a lot of sex in this film, a lot of bodies, a lot of nudity, a lot of explicit sex scenes. And the thing is, it's not very sexy at all. Sex in this film is kind of depressing, interesting to analyse, but also sad. It seems to be all body, no love. And the sheer prominence of sex in this film is almost overwhelming as well. Bella, the protagonist, has a voracious sexual appetite, and from the moment she discovers how to touch herself, sexual pleasure becomes a focal point in her life. She does develop as a character beyond this, but nevertheless, that's not before the majority of her growth and coming of age have been framed through the lens of hypersexual experiences. Of course, this film is in fact based on a book, so perhaps the director is not to blame for this focus. And naturally, sex on screen is not bad, it's just a decision. So what's the problem? The protagonist in Poor Things would be a completely different human being if she didn't have sexual experiences. There is no her without sex. And of course, portraying women having sex in film can actually be a valuable directorial decision. Films that highlight female sexuality and emphasize sexual experience in coming-of-age stories in fact exist as an important backlash to conservative cinematic and social traditions that figured young women as chaste and uninterested in sex. Films like Water Lilies, Lady Bird, Booksmart, all directed by women incidentally, these figure sexual experimentation as a natural and significant part of growing up. Are valuable for helping to normalize and destigmatize experiences that many women encounter or seek out when transitioning from girlhood to adulthood. However, I would argue that some films overemphasize sexual awakening as integral to growth and maturity, and in doing so, they do women a disservice. Poor Things is a good example of this. The film fixates on the centrality of sex to the protagonist Bella's development and story. On the one hand, this fixation can be seen as indicative of how the society around her reads her and treats her, a woman, in significant part as a body. Yet on the other hand, the film also ironically further enshrines this perception of Bella as a body first and foremost through its emphasis on her sexual awakening. That the protagonist gains awareness through or in tandem with sex also further enshrines the idea that a woman's awareness is almost bequeathed on her via sexual experience with a man. It's the old notion of you were a girl, then you had sex, and now you are a woman. A notion I have always hated. It has always struck me as really reductive and heteronormative. And on a personal level too, I find the idea kind of offensive. I remember being a teen and seeing how sex was a focal point in all sorts of films and pop culture, and I remember feeling really alienated by that because I wasn't so much as holding hands with anyone then, but I didn't feel less human or less mature because of it. There are so many ways as a human to expand and grow and flourish with or without sex. So my personal gripe with Poor Things was that it leant way too far into a trope that I hate, which is namely the conflation of sex with growth and maturity and enlightenment. And the fact that it was a male director too who decided to craft the film in this way also makes me kind of suspicious. I find myself asking, to what extent is this film crafted to be a challenging comment on how women are reduced to their bodies and sexual value? Or to what extent does the film actually kind of perpetuate this reduction through its very deliberate inclusion of many sexual montages? Does the director even know the answer to these questions? Or is he simply seeking to challenge us without offering a particular opinion or direct perspective? And is this effective? We'll talk about this more later. Another friend of mine made an amazing comment that strongly applies to this film. She studies speculative fiction, and she said, when speculative fiction revolves around men, the question at the story's core is this person human? Yet when speculative fiction revolves around women, the question at the story's core is not, is this person human, but rather, is this creature a woman? Personally, I think this is a great point. Does this male-coded creature have humanity is indeed a question at the core of stories ranging from Frankenstein to Blade Runner, and you even see it in fairy tales like Beauty and the Beast. The question is about whether this creature or monster or cyborg has some sort of inherent humanity. Can they cultivate it or return to it? Will we recognize them by the end of the story as being a person? In Poor Things, on the other hand, the female protagonist, the monstrous female protagonist, is seen so much as a body and as a female body that the question of how human she is or to what extent she really counts as a person is rarely the focal point of the film. The film and the characters within it are all very preoccupied by the protagonist's sexual value, and in the end she becomes a different kind of woman, more cultivated by the standards of the society within which she exists, but I would argue she never really becomes more a person than a woman. What's more, the characters and society surrounding this protagonist don't really allow her to be more of a person than a woman, and the film, I would argue, is guilty of spending more time on sex than on her interiority, and that is a choice. Okay, yeah, sure, she listens to some Portuguese fado music, but that's not enough. After my friend raised this point, I thought more about this trope of a character being more woman than human, and about how this appears in films. And I realised that the genre in which many female monsters reside, namely the horror genre, employs this trope a lot. The question about whether these women are still people or are simply monsters is often determined based on how they use their bodies. Stories involving possessed women, for example, might show these female characters suddenly becoming sex-crazed as opposed to the chaste little Catholic schoolgirls that they began the story as. I'm pretty sure The Exorcist has a very controversial scene involving a crucifix that plays into precisely this trope. How sexual the woman is determines how monstrous she is deemed to be. And so the question of is she still a person comes to revolve in large part around how is she using her body and how is her body being perceived by others. It's also no coincidence that movies involving female monsters often involve creepy babies and reproductive disasters, kind of like Possession, for example, from 1981, weird sex scenes. It's all part of this trope linking women and monstrosity with, above all, their bodies and their sexuality. It's also worth noting that the more self-aware Bella becomes, the less she seems to voraciously seek out sex. At the beginning of the film, her behaviour is very unconventional and monstrous by the standards of her society. She spits out her food, she's sexual in public, etc. By the end of the film, she's far more chaste and also articulate, and therefore comes across as much more of a passable Victorian lady. So when I see Poor Things hyper-focusing on the sexuality of this female creature protagonist, it reminds me of ways in which films often do the humanity of women a disservice by potentially not even really exploring the humanity of female-coded creatures. And it just makes me wish that we had more complex films that really delve into the humanity of these creatures rather than always just kind of asking, but how does she have sex? Is she having sex? How does her monstrosity relate to whether she's having sex? And with this in mind, one can ask, does this character development actually figure sexual pleasure and women who enjoy sex as base and animalistic and psychologically underdeveloped? Much like the sexualized women who go off the rails in horror movies. They're out of their minds. They want sex, they're out of their minds. Is this portrayal of sex in Poor Things therefore really doing anyone any favors, or is it just playing into some pretty tired old tropes? I'd say that given the film is being lauded as feminist, yet also seems to play into some of these fairly conservative sex-related tropes that we see in horror movies, for instance, it could be worth questioning whether this film is actually as progressive as some people seem to think it is. I'm realizing at this point of recording that I'm definitely sounding like a real killjoy. I'm definitely open to alternative opinions on this film. However, I'm afraid to say that my criticisms of this film are still not done, so I'm going to try and wrap it up. My last main point is that this film and others like it risk dehumanizing women further in the way that they reduce women to bodies, and that furthering of this reduction is the possibility that they reduce women and female characters to sex slaves within the story. Now, some might argue that the film is just being provocative, and I guess kudos to the film. It's certainly very thought-provoking, and I, for one, enjoy a thought-provoking film. However, the film does also raise really unsettling questions about consent that it potentially doesn't explore critically enough. When Bella is having sex with adults, she literally has the mind of a child and therefore cannot actually consent. And the film doesn't really explore this in a critical manner whatsoever. A problem of being uncritical of this element of the film is that the film kind of ends on an upbeat note. At the end, Bella is presented as empowered. However, given the fact that she can't really consent, one kind of has to question, is she really empowered at the end of this film? She seems empowered at first glance. She has moved from the symbolic constraints and the literal constraints of the house to the freedom of the garden. She can read, she can study, people bring her drinks and food at her command. Life seems pretty sweet. Her abusive ex-husband has been mutilated using scientific methods and now literally has the mind of a goat. But then one must ask, does Bella have Stockholm syndrome? She was, in a sense, literally groomed from childhood to eventually marry the person that she married. Her guardian consents to her marrying before her mind has developed in any significant way. She can't even speak in complex sentences when she agrees to marry her eventual husband. With this in mind, my killjoy moment, I'm not really so sure that the film is that feminist after all, or at least I don't think the freedom that Bella attains at the film's end merits the happy ending, the sunlit garden, and the implied happy resolution of the story. After all, Bella is eternally a prisoner to some degree. She's a prisoner in a body that was never meant to house her, and she is like this because of decisions that men made about her body and about what to do with it. Is this emancipation? I don't think so. Like many aspects of this film, something may look good on the surface, but there are a whole lot of problematic things going on underneath. The question of whether Bella ends up free may not matter to some viewers, but I'd argue that given the film presents itself as a story about personal growth and self-discovery and about becoming financially independent and being able to come and go as one pleases, well, it is kind of significant that the film's ending is positioned as feminist, when realistically the protagonist has also been raped and groomed and coerced. Maybe some people would argue that she wins in the end. She overcomes the odds and she beats the system and she ends up in power. You read that book, girl. But I'm not here to spread joy. I'd argue that the film has a veneer of feminism, but that's all it is. A veneer. And the book was probably just a stage prop anyway, with the words lorem ipsum on the inside a million times over. I also want to briefly mention the danger of presenting women above all as bodies, and of perhaps further enshrining this idea. I was reading about a risk that vulnerable women face sometimes, for example, when they're living on the street, and that risk is actually that of being taken in. It's something that happens to some women because even if, for example, they are completely cognitively out of it, because of their bodies, they still retain sexual value and reproductive value. When a man is cognizantly no longer with it or no longer capable of working, his body might not be viewed as being valuable because he can't labour anymore. But women sometimes retain, or often retain, that sexual value. And that raises this complicated issue wherein some people feel like they're really helping a vulnerable woman by taking her in, but there's also something kind of potentially exploitative about that. And it's directly related to this social or cultural tendency, perhaps, to see women in large part for their bodies, for what their bodies have to offer. In short, one can argue that in Poor Things we see a similar situation with Bella being taken in. However, the film doesn't actually explore this dynamic about her vulnerability in that situation. It doesn't really explore it in any particularly critical way, and given how complex and unsettling the real life issue of women being taken in is, I think that's a real shame. Now, of course, film can be an excellent and safe place to explore difficult and challenging ideas. I like experimental and complex films, and I'm glad Poor Things was made. I'm happy I saw it. Yet I also find it troubling that Poor Things is being lauded as feminist, given it plays into quite a few tropes and ideas in a fairly uncritical manner. Because the reality is, film can also perpetuate problematic beliefs with real-world social ramifications, such as the idea that a person who appears to be a sexually mature woman, but who is actually either a child or has the mind of a child, is in any way capable of consent, because they're not. So is Poor Things terrible, or is it simply making a point? Whether a person thinks Poor Things is terrible or not will likely depend on whether they think it is merely portraying a situation and leaving it open to interpretation, or that it is portraying a situation and thereby making a statement through its portrayal, because all portrayals are inherently a bit biased and a bit political. I really wanted to like Poor Things, as we know, and I really appreciated that it portrayed certain complexities without necessarily ramming a single answer down the viewer's throat. I appreciated that, and I may yet revise my ideas, who knows. However, I am of the belief that films and creative decisions are inherently political, consciously or otherwise. And the ending of Poor Things tries to spin the film as an edgy feminist fable, but the story is actually pretty regressive in some ways, as well as degrading. Now, of course, there are many other lenses through which one can analyse this film. One can talk at length about the cinematography and the acting and how great it is that a slightly more experimental film is being made rather than another derivative chapter in a very dull action franchise. I'm all for your edgy art house films. But this particular film simply left me, my adult human brain, and the cockles of my feminist heart as cold as a corpse. And on that cheerful note, that is all for today. Quick reminder that these are just my hot takes, my views are my own, and I'm also aware this is a really rich text and there are a lot of ways in which one can approach it and analyse it. So I'm also very interested in hearing your opinions about the film and your interpretations, even if they are wrong or inferior to my own. I am joking. Not unlike the protagonist in Poor Things, we are all works in progress, and I am no exception. So thank you for spending this time with me, and have a beautiful day, and don't let yourself get abducted by any strange men, even if they do want to take you to Portugal. I know it's tempting. Portugal is great, but that's why we've got to be careful out there, okay?